There's a specific kind of silence that happens on a team bus at midnight, somewhere between two cities, when everyone else is asleep and the streetlights slide across the windows like slow-motion film. That's the silence I remember most from that season, not the roar of the crowd, not the scoreboard, but the weight of Callum Reyes' head against my shoulder, and the way he'd mumble "you're warm" like it explained everything, and nothing at all. He told everyone he was straight. He told me too, more than once, usually right after he'd done something that made it very hard to believe him. This is the story of a locker room, a losing season, and a boy who learned that the hardest opponent he'd ever face was the truth about his own heart. Jonah Ade had been benchwarming for Fairview University's soccer team long enough to know the exact temperature of humiliation. It lived somewhere between not good enough and not worth the risk, and Coach Marsh served it fresh every Saturday. He didn't expect the new transfer to change that. Callum Reyes arrived in August with a duffel bag, a reputation for being difficult, and a habit of looking at everyone like he was deciding whether they were worth his time. He was faster than anyone on the team, and he knew it, which made him insufferable in the way that only genuinely talented people can be. "You're staring," Callum said, catching Jonah's eye across the locker room on his first day. "I'm evaluating," Jonah said. "Coach wants scouting notes." "And? You run like you're being chased by something." Something flickered behind Callum's eyes, gone before Jonah could name it. "Maybe I am," he said, and pulled his shirt over his head like the conversation was over. Jonah didn't think about it again. Not for 3 more days, anyway. They ended up running extra laps together by accident. Coach Marsh's punishment for a sloppy scrimmage, and accidents, Jonah would later realize, were rarely as accidental as they seemed. "You always run like this?" Callum asked, matching his pace. "Like you're apologizing to the track?" "I run like someone who doesn't want to get cut," Jonah said. "You won't get cut. You don't know that. I know you're the only guy on this team who watches film of himself and actually takes notes instead of making excuses." Callum glanced sideways. "I noticed." Jonah slowed half a step, surprised. "You noticed?" "I notice things." Callum sped up again, like he regretted saying it. "Don't make it weird." It was already weird. Jonah just didn't have a word for it yet. Their friendship built itself out of small, unremarkable things: shared protein bars, a 2 a.m. text about a missed penalty kick, the discovery that they both hated the color of the away jerseys. Callum started sitting next to Jonah on the bus without asking. Jonah started saving him a seat without being asked to. It was on a rain-soaked Thursday, waiting out a delayed practice under the stadium overhang, that Callum said, out of nowhere, "My dad played here." "Same position. Same number. That why you picked Fairview?" "That's why I picked soccer." Callum stared at the rain. He wanted a version of himself that finished what he started. "I'm still working on that." Jonah didn't say anything clever. He just stood there, letting the silence hold both of them, and something about not filling it seemed to be exactly what Callum needed. "Thanks for not asking more," Callum said quietly. "I figured you'd tell me when you wanted to." Callum looked at him, then really looked, in a way that made Jonah's chest feel like it had been tuned to a different frequency. The bus ride back from the away game in Concordia was 4 hours of dark highway and bad radio. Somewhere around hour 2, Callum's head dropped onto Jonah's shoulder. Jonah went very still. "You awake?" he whispered. Callum said, which wasn't an answer. Jonah didn't move him. He told himself it was because moving would wake him up, and waking him up would be rude, and none of that explained why his heart was doing something complicated and stupid in his chest. When Callum stirred an hour later and realized where his head was, he sat up fast, rubbing his neck. "Sorry. Didn't mean to. You're warm, that's all." "It's cold on this bus." "It's fine. I'm not, that wasn't a thing." "I know," Jonah said, even though some small, dangerous part of him was starting to hope it was. It became a pattern. Callum fell asleep on Jonah's shoulder more nights than not, and every time, he woke up with an explanation ready, like he'd rehearsed it. The bus was cold, he hadn't slept the night before, Jonah just happened to be there. "You don't have to explain every time," Jonah finally said, one night in November. "I'm not explaining anything." You are. You do it every time like you're worried I'll think something. Callum's jaw tightened. Because there's nothing to think. I didn't say there was. You're doing that thing where you go quiet and it means you're thinking it anyway. Jonah turned to face him. I think you're scared of something, and I don't think it's me. Callum didn't answer. He grabbed his bag and moved 2 seats up, and neither of them slept for the rest of the ride. It was their teammate Isaiah who said the thing neither of them would. You two fight like people who like each other, Isaiah said one afternoon, tossing a ball between his hands. Just so you know. In case nobody's told you. We're friends, Jonah said. That's it. Sure. Isaiah didn't push. For what it's worth, Cal's been different since you got close. Less angry. You should know that counts for something, whatever it is. Jonah turned that over for days. He wasn't looking for permission, he wasn't sure permission was even the right word, but hearing it from someone else made the thing he'd been avoiding a little harder to keep avoiding. He decided he needed to know, one way or another, even if the answer cost him a friendship he'd come to depend on more than he wanted to admit. He chose the worst possible moment after a loss, in an empty locker room, both of them still sweating and raw with disappointment. I need to say something, Jonah said, and I need you to actually hear it instead of running. Callum's shoulders tensed. Jonah. You fall asleep on me every bus ride. You get defensive every time I bring it up. You told me you're straight about 6 times, which is a strange thing to keep insisting if it's true. Jonah's voice shook, but he kept going. I don't need you to be anything. I just need you to stop pretending I don't see you. The silence stretched long enough that Jonah thought he'd lost him completely. I don't know what I am, Callum finally said, voice cracking. My dad has a whole life planned for me. A whole idea of who I'm supposed to be. And every time I think about this, I think about disappointing him, and I panic, and I say something stupid to make it go away. I'm not asking you to fix your whole life in one conversation. I know. But I'm asking for time I'm not sure I get to have. Callum looked at him, eyes wet. I'm sorry. He left before Jonah could respond. Callum stopped sitting next to him on the bus. He answered texts in single words, if he answered at all. Coach noticed the shift in chemistry on the field and benched them both in the same game out of frustration, which felt, to Jonah, like a cruel kind of poetry. Jonah threw himself into training instead, early mornings, extra film, anything that kept his hands busy and his mind quiet. He told himself he'd said what needed saying and the rest was Callum's to carry. It didn't stop him from missing him. It didn't stop the empty seat on the bus from feeling like the loudest thing in the world. 3 weeks passed like that, polite, careful, wrong. The twist came from somewhere Jonah didn't expect, not a grand gesture, but a phone call from Callum's father, forwarded through Coach Marsh, asking why his son had suddenly stopped talking to him. Callum had told him. Not about Jonah specifically, not yet, but about wanting a life his father hadn't planned for him. About needing room to figure out who he was without a blueprint waiting at the end of it. His father hadn't taken it well. But Callum, for the first time, hadn't taken it back. He found Jonah after practice, soaked from a rainstorm that had rolled in during the last 10 minutes, and didn't bother getting out of it. I told my dad I'm not finishing his story, Callum said. I'm starting my own. I don't know yet what all of it looks like. But I know I want you somewhere in it, if you'll still have me. Jonah stood there, rain running down both their faces, and felt something in his chest finally exhale. You're an idiot for waiting this long. Probably, Callum said. Is that a yes? Ask me properly. Callum laughed a real laugh, unguarded, the kind Jonah had only heard a handful of times all season. He stepped closer, rain-soaked and steady in a way he hadn't been in weeks. Jonah Ade. I like you. I've liked you since the bus to Concordia, maybe before that. I'm done pretending I don't. Took you long enough, Jonah said, and closed the distance himself. Spring came, and with it, a new season. Callum still fell asleep on Jonah's shoulder on long bus rides, but he didn't wake up with an excuse ready anymore. Sometimes he just laced their fingers together instead, like the explanation had never mattered, only the honesty underneath it. Isaiah never let them forget how obvious they'd been. Coach Marsh, to everyone's shock, turned out not to care at all, as long as they showed up and played. Callum's father came around slowly, in the halting, imperfect way that real people do. A phone call here, an awkward visit there, small steps instead of a movie-perfect reconciliation. It wasn't finished. But it was starting. On the last bus ride of the season, Callum leaned his head against Jonah's shoulder without waiting for the dark to hide it. "You're warm," he said. "I know," Jonah said, smiling at the window. "You keep saying that like it's new information." "It's not," Callum admitted. "I just like saying it now. Out loud. Where it's true." Outside, the city lights slid past the glass, and for the first time all year, the silence between them didn't feel like something either of them needed to explain. Falling in love is the easy part, it turns out. Nobody warns you about the part after, the part where you have to keep choosing each other in front of people who didn't get a vote, where old wounds show up uninvited, where the version of your life you built in secret has to survive being seen in daylight. This is what happened to Jonah and Callum in the year after the rain, the confession, and the bus ride home, when love stopped being a secret and started being a life. Nobody made an announcement. There was no locker room speech, no dramatic reveal. It happened the way most true things happen, quietly, and then all at once. It started with Callum reaching for Jonah's hand at a team dinner, not thinking about who was watching, because he'd stopped performing the thought of not thinking about it months ago. A few teammates blinked. Isaiah grinned like he'd won a bet with himself. Nobody said anything, because by then, there wasn't much left to say. That felt anticlimactic, Callum admitted later, walking back to the dorms. "Good," Jonah said. "I didn't want a climax. I wanted dinner." Callum bumped his shoulder against Jonah's. "You're annoyingly wise sometimes." "Sometimes? Don't push it. Not everyone made peace so easily." Callum's father, Mr. Reyes, had softened over the winter, phone calls instead of silence, a stiff handshake instead of no visit at all, but softened wasn't the same as arrived. He came to a spring game, the first in over a year, and sat in the stands with his arms crossed like a man bracing for something. Afterward, in the parking lot, he found Callum still in his cleats, sweat damp and wary. "You played well," his father said. Then, after a pause that cost him something, "Your friend Jonah. He's good for you." It wasn't the word Callum wanted. But it was a door, cracked instead of locked, and Callum had learned enough that year to know doors like that didn't open twice if you slammed them out of pride. "He's not just my friend, Dad." "I know." His father looked at his shoes. "I'm working on the rest of the sentence. Give me time." "You've had a year. I've had 30 years of a different sentence in my head. Yours is going to take longer to learn." He met Callum's eyes, steadier than before. "But I'm trying to say it right. That has to count for something." Callum didn't forgive him completely that day. But he let him stay for dinner, and that, for both of them, was a start worth having. If Callum's fear had been his father, Jonah's fear arrived in a much smaller package, a scholarship offer from a professional development academy 3 states away. He hadn't told Callum for a week, turning the letter over in his hands like it might change its mind if he waited long enough. "You're hiding something," Callum said finally, cornering him in the equipment room. "You've been doing the thing where you go quiet and pretend you're not." Jonah handed him the letter without a word. Callum read it twice. "This is incredible. It's 3 states away. I know how geography works, Jonah. I don't want to be the reason you didn't say something like that to me a year ago, and then turn around and be the reason we don't work now." Callum set the letter down carefully, like it deserved respect. "You're not responsible for keeping us together by staying small. If you turn this down for me, I'll spend the next 4 years wondering what you gave up, and it'll poison every good thing we build. Go. We'll figure out the rest." You make it sound simple. It's not simple. It's just worth it. Callum took his hand. "I didn't fight that hard to get here just to ask you to shrink for me. The distance that followed wasn't the cold, silent kind from before. It was full of late-night calls, terrible video connections, plane tickets bought on birthdays and holidays, and the particular ache of missing someone whose absence you'd chosen on purpose because it was right for both of you. They fought sometimes about missed calls, about time zones, about the loneliness that crept in on hard days. But they fought like people building something, not like people protecting a secret. That difference, Jonah found, changed everything about how much a fight could cost you. "I hate this part," Callum admitted one night, voice small over a bad connection. "Which part?" "The part where you're not actually here. I got used to your shoulder." "You'll survive," Jonah said, smiling at his screen. "You survived 30 years without me. I didn't know what I was missing then." "That's different." They found their way back to each other that summer, not because distance had broken them, but because both of them had done the harder work of becoming people worth coming back to. Jonah flew in for 2 weeks before preseason. Callum met him at the gate holding a sign that said, in his own terrible handwriting, "You're warm and I missed it." "That's humiliating," Jonah said, laughing. "That's honesty," Callum said. "I stopped being embarrassed by it a while ago." They didn't need the bus anymore, or the dark, or the excuse of cold air. Callum leaned his head on Jonah's shoulder in the middle of a crowded airport, in full daylight, in front of everyone, because there was nothing left to explain and nothing left to hide. "You're warm," he said. "I know," Jonah answered. "You keep saying that like it's new information." "It's not," Callum said, threading their fingers together. "I just like that I get to keep saying it. Out loud. For the rest of it. Nobody tells you that love, once it survives the beginning, has to learn how to survive the middle, the ordinary years, the small disappointments, the moments where two separate lives have to decide, again and again, to become one shared life instead. This is what happened to Jonah and Callum 3 years later, when soccer stopped being the whole story and became just one chapter in a much bigger one. Jonah's development academy became a professional contract with a second division club 2 hours from the city Callum had settled in after graduation, coaching youth soccer at the same community center where his own career had first taken root. It wasn't the plan either of them had pictured at 19. It was better, in the quiet, unglamorous way real life often is. They'd learned, over the years, to measure their relationship in small rituals instead of grand gestures, Sunday phone calls that lasted longer than they should have, a shared calendar color-coded for away games and school breaks, a running joke about who forgot to defrost dinner more often. "You know we could just live in the same city," Callum said one Sunday, only half joking. "You have a job you love. I have a job I love. We're allowed to have both." "I know. I just miss falling asleep next to you instead of imagining it." 2 more years on my contract," Jonah said. "Then we talk about it seriously. I'm holding you to that." Callum's work at the community center had turned into something neither of them expected, a room full of teenagers who watched him with the particular hunger of kids looking for proof that a life like theirs could turn out okay. One of them, a quiet 15-year-old named Theo, cornered him after practice one day, staring at his cleats instead of Callum's face. "Is it true? What the older kids say about you?" And he gestured vaguely, the way people do when a sentence feels too dangerous to finish. "About my boyfriend?" Callum said gently. "Yeah. It's true." Theo nodded slowly, still not looking up. "My dad says stuff about guys like that. I didn't know if you could still be good at this. At soccer. At anything." Callum crouched down to his level. "I used to think the same thing. I spent a long time thinking I had to choose between being good at something and being honest about who I was. I was wrong. You don't have to choose. Anybody who tells you that you do is giving you bad information." Theo didn't say much else that day. But he came back the next week, and the week after that, and eventually he stopped flinching when the other kids joked about Callum's husband, which was what they'd started calling Jonah, half in teasing and half in genuine affection. The invitation came in the mail, addressed to both of them, "Reyes family reunion, bring whoever makes you happy." Callum's handwriting on the envelope told him his father hadn't written it himself, but had clearly approved every word. "He's never done anything like this," Callum said, staring at it. Do you want to go? I want you to come with me. As Callum paused, testing a word he hadn't said out loud to family before. As my partner. Not my friend. Not my roommate. The actual word. Jonas squeezed his hand. Then let's go say the actual word. The reunion was loud and overwhelming and full of cousins Callum hadn't seen in a decade, but the moment that mattered most happened quietly, at the edge of the yard, where Mr. Reyes found them both standing by the drink table. Jonah, he said, extending a hand. Good to finally have you here properly. Thank you for having me. Mr. Reyes hesitated, then added, stiffly but sincerely, you make my son sound like himself when he talks about you. That took me a long time to want to hear. I'm glad I finally did. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't the speech either of them had imagined years ago in a rainstorm. But it was real, and earned, and enough. 2 years passed the way Jonah had promised, full of Sunday calls and away games and small rituals that slowly stopped feeling like substitutes for a shared life and started feeling like the architecture of one. When his contract ended, he didn't sign another one 2 hours away. He signed with a club 15 minutes from Callum's front door. He didn't tell Callum in advance. He showed up at the community center instead, mid-practice, cleats still on, and waited by the fence until Callum noticed him. You're not supposed to be here for another month, Callum said, jogging over, confused. I moved the timeline up. Jonah reached into his bag and pulled out a small box, plain and a little dented from travel. I figured if I was finally close enough to ask this properly, I shouldn't wait for a better moment. This is the moment. You're standing in it. Callum stared at the box, then at him, then at the box again, laughing in the stunned, disbelieving way people laugh when something they wanted for years finally becomes real in front of them. You're doing this in front of a bunch of 15-year-olds, he said. They've been rooting for us since Theo told everyone you cried during a phone call once. I did not cry. You absolutely cried. Jonah got down on one knee anyway, ignoring the small crowd of kids who'd stopped their drills to watch. Callum Reyes. You spent a whole season falling asleep on my shoulder and making up excuses for it. I don't need an excuse anymore, and I don't think you do either. Marry me. Callum didn't answer with words at first, just closed the distance the way he had that day in the rain, unhesitating, certain, home. Yes, he finally said, against Jonah's shoulder. Obviously, yes. Behind them, a row of teenagers erupted into cheering that had absolutely nothing to do with soccer. They got married the following spring, in a small ceremony at the community center where Callum had rebuilt himself into someone whole. Theo, 17 by then and taller than either of them, stood near the front with the rest of the kids Callum had coached, all of them a little too proud to admit how much the day meant to them. Mr. Reyes gave a short, imperfect toast that ended with his voice breaking halfway through a sentence about second chances. Isaiah gave a much longer, much less appropriate one, which everyone laughed through anyway. Later that night, dancing slow in a room full of string lights, Callum rested his head on Jonah's shoulder out of habit more than tiredness. You're warm, he murmured. I know, Jonah said, smiling into his hair. You've been saying that for 6 years. Get used to it, Callum said. I plan on saying it for a lot more. Outside, the night was quiet in the particular way that means something has finally, fully arrived, no rain to hide in, no bus to fall asleep on, no excuse left to make. Just two men who had chosen each other, over and over, until choosing stopped feeling like a risk and started feeling like the truest thing either of them knew.